Let me introduce myself. I'm the moderator, the chair today. My name is Jan Priewe. I'm from IMK, Senior Research Fellow there, former professor here at Berlin University. And I'm also one of the founders of this conference 24 years ago. We have the panel, a very exceptional panel, for two reasons. The title of our panel is The Future of Global Capitalism. We never had in this series of conferences this kind of title, but we believe that there is a strong interest right presently to analyze what kind of system we live in and in what direction the road or the roads are going, and how we can influence the roads which we would prefer to take. This has to do with climate change and long-term changes in the environmental surroundings of the system we are living in, and it has also to do with the fact that we have different forms of capitalism on our planet now. But all capitalisms, or as Branko wrote, capitalism is alone. We have three eminent speakers today, and my introduction will be very brief for all three because they are well known. I start with Dani Rodrik. He is the first presenter, and he is from Harvard School of J. F. Kennedy School of Governance, and his area of research and publication is mainly, as most of you know, political economy and trade globalization issues. The second is Joe Stiglitz. You know, he's the Nobel Prize winner, or one of the Nobel Prize winners from 2001, and has received so many awards that there is no time to list them. So we are very proud to have him too here with the others. And Branko Milanovic is from City University, New York, and he wrote presently, or just last year, a book on the future of global capitalism, or the title is Capitalism Alone, and it is in the bestseller list as far as I know. And of course, we would like to hear the key points of this book. So we have to start now as soon as possible with Dani because of the time difference and some misunderstandings about the 5 hours instead of 6 hours time difference to New York. Dani has to leave in 1 hour at 3 o'clock New York time and 8 o'clock Berlin time. So Dani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan, and apologies again to you and my co-panelists whose remarks I may have to miss, or the discussion as well, that unfortunately I do have to leave at 3 my time. I think that our system of capitalism faces two major challenges that it has not fully addressed. One is climate change, and I think we all understand the contours and the magnitude of that challenge. That's actually not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about a second challenge, which I think is in many ways as serious, and I don't think we have really taken it on board nearly to the same extent. And that's sort of the good jobs challenge. I think our market economy produces what I call good jobs externalities in the same way that it produces environmental externalities, and I think that creates rationale for significant public intervention. And the whole question is what form that intervention really should take. So I'll make a few remarks about that. So if we can move to the next slide, please. The problem of good jobs, I think, it reflects itself in a process of deepening economic dualism within nations. We're used to talking about dualism in the context of poor nations, developing countries, but increasingly Very similar phenomenon is taking place in the advanced countries as well, with a very stark divide, which is partly spatial, partly plays out in the labor markets, between those parts of the economy which are technologically advanced, globally integrated, produces good jobs, and large segments of the economy that doesn't do those things. And I think COVID-19 in many ways actually is aggravating seriously a trend that was already in place in our labor markets for quite some time. I think many of our contemporary troubles originate from this process of labor market dualism or polarization, problems of inequality, and even where economic inequality doesn't show up in the Gini coefficients, a pervasive sense of economic insecurity, backlash against globalization, very seriously a process of political polarization, and in the context of developing countries, a process of premature deindustrialization and the slowing down of the time tried and tested export-oriented industrialization engine for growth. Next slides, please. In the markets, in the labor markets of the advanced countries, I think this is probably the one picture that tells the story as well as any could. This is the problem of the disappearing middle in the employment distribution. If we just rank all the jobs in terms of those that are less skilled and lowest paying to those that are highest paid and most skilled, it's really where employment demand and earnings is collapsing is essentially in the middle of this distribution. And this is what's been called labor market polarization. It's very common in the context of the advanced market. And sort of that's what underlies, I think, the erosion of the middle class in essentially the vast majority of advanced countries today, as the next slide shows. This is, I'm not going to go through this for reasons of time, but essentially in almost all of these OECD countries, the size of the middle class has shrunk. We'll move to the next slide. If we turn to sort of the implications of COVID, as I said, that's simply accelerating that trend. As we know, the effects of COVID on the labor markets have been highly uneven and heterogeneous, and the vast majority of job losses, which are likely to prove permanent, have been in relatively low pay, low skill industries such as food and beverage services, clothing and retail, support and accommodation services, the bulk of which are really low skill. And you can see this going to significantly aggravate that problem. Next slide, please. In the developing countries, we have a somewhat parallel process that's going on. And we're used to thinking about the process of development that essentially carries workers from the countryside, traditional agricultural production, informal economic activities, to industrialization, to urban manufacturing, more productive, more organized, formal set of activities, and ultimately into services. This is the traditional model of economic and political development. Today, what's taking place is what we see in the next slide, which is a very different process where farmers are leaving the countryside and urban areas are expanding. But what's not expanding are those jobs in the middle, the more productive manufacturing, production workers, production jobs in manufacturing. In fact, most of the people who are leaving the countryside are now going essentially to urban, petty, informal services at very low productivity. And manufacturing is not capturing, is not taking off in any serious way. This is a process that I've called premature deindustrialization. Is the developing country equivalent of the disappearance of good jobs next slide, please. So The crux of the matter is the relative scarcity of good jobs. This is being driven by a number of secular trends having to do with technological changes, with globalization. And the main argument that I want to make is that this is going to require a new set of government policies that have to target the supply of good jobs directly. Next slide, please. This new approach, I think, is perhaps best seen by using this matrix that gives us sort of the landscape of policies that we employ currently, because it'll help us distinguish between our traditional economic policy frameworks and, I think, a new policy framework that we need. So this is a matrix that essentially help us locate what the objective of policy is and where it impinges on the operation of market systems. So the columns have to do with the stage of the economy in which we intervene. We can intervene at the pre-production stage, at the production stage, or at the post-production stage. And the rows have to do with the part of the distribution of income that we're most directly trying to address. So we might be addressing directly poverty issues, that's at the very bottom of the income distribution. We might be targeting the super wealthy, addressing inequality from the very top, or we might be addressing the needs of the middle class, and that sort of would be the middle row. Next slide, please. We look at the landscape of economic policies in most countries. Essentially, pretty much all of these cells are full of different kinds of policies. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think it's useful to start from the essential focus of our traditional conception of welfare state policies, which largely focus on the pre-production and the post-production columns of this matrix. So next slide, please. Our traditional welfare state model, including its updated version with flexicurity and much more focus on training for new technologies and so forth, essentially focuses on two things. One is to increase the endowments of the potential workers, that is by investing in training, education, in skills, preparing future workers for entering the labor market with as much skill and training and education. So that's the pre-production part of the welfare state model. But also there is a post-production, that is that, just to make sure that people who fall through the cracks, who need unemployment compensation or are hit by idiosyncratic shocks, we have an intricate set of tax and transfer policies that redistribute income after production has taken place. So those are the essential two legs of our traditional welfare state conception of how we create inclusive societies. Next slide, please. I think when we confronted the needs of good jobs with this conception of the welfare state, I think there is a kind of inadequacy of the welfare state model, because essentially the welfare state model presumes that good jobs are going to be available to essentially everybody who has adequate education and skills, and therefore essentially just focuses on the kind of provision of social insurance to provide safety nets for those who might fall through the cracks. But I would argue that the good jobs problem and the problems of inequality and economic insecurity in which it is reflected is much more of a structural problem that is driven by secular trends. And when technology and globalization and deindustrialization sort of have the effect of hollowing out the middle of the employment distribution, then we have a structural problem that's going to exhibit itself in the form of these permanent bad jobs and permanently depressed regional labor markets. And I think that's going to require a different strategy that tackles good job creation directly. In other words, it's no good to, let's say, invest in education, skills, and training if if the supply of good jobs in which those skills and training can be appropriately deployed are inadequate or insufficient. So we need to address that supply of good job problem directly. Next slide, please. So in terms of that matrix, so what I'd like to propose is that I think our future model for capitalism is one that's going to focus much more directly in this middle cell or the middle column of this matrix, directly addressing the employment, innovation, production, investment decisions of firms with a view towards getting them to internalize these good job externalities. And when good jobs go scarce in particular communities, the consequences are both a sort of a lack of dissemination of technologies throughout the rest of the economy, as well as very serious social and political problems ranging from crime to broken families to addiction problems to political polarization and an increase in authoritarian values as a result of economic authority. Next slide, please. One of the key planks of this approach, I believe, is to rethink the relationship between technology and labor markets. I find it very odd that when we talk about how labor markets have to adjust to changes in technology, the conversation is almost always in the following form. And so that's the quote here on the slide. That technology is rapidly changing the skills needed on the job, and therefore workers need to adjust through increased education and continuous training. In other words, so we take this technological change as completely exogenous, and we put the whole burden of adjustment on labor, on workers to acquire the requisite skills. But I don't think this is a battle that we can actually win. I think what technology has to do is work for society and generate jobs for the kind of workers that exist, rather than the kinds of workers that we wish we had, or we hope we might have in 25 years. I think the fact is, and I think this is now increasingly being recognized in the economics literature, is that technology has a direction, just as we think of investing in green technologies to internalize climate change externalities, we need to start thinking about giving technological change and innovation a direction in which it is much more friendly to labor. We know that the direction of technology responds to incentives. For example, in advanced countries, we basically tax workers but subsidize investment in automation. That's clearly a way of replacing labor. Technological direction, the direction of technological change depends on norms in sort of embedded innovation systems in Silicon Valley, and also responds to relative power. Who gets to have a say in the workplace as to what type of technologies are adopted and applied in the workplace. So I think when we look at the range of technologies that are available even today, in terms of the tools that are used in AI or various other kinds of new technologies, there's a range of options that are available with respect to pushing technology that in a direction that is much more of a labor augmenting kind, giving lower or middle skilled workers augmenting the skills with which they can actually perform the jobs of more skilled, higher skilled professionals, rather than essentially replacing them. And that, of course, would have to go alongside with the kinds of social and labor protections that we normally think of in terms of the determinants of a good job. But I think it's going to be very important to recognize that we need conscious policies to redirect innovation in a much more labor-friendly direction, in the same way that we have started to think about investing in green technologies, or in the same way that advanced countries invest in national security technologies that are useful for that advanced national security. Next slide. I think when we think about how to apply these ideas, I think it's going to require a kind of a new version of what used to be called industrial policy. Next slide, please. Except that it's not really about manufacturing industries per se. It's really about, economy-wide. I think the traditional type of industrial policy was, basically presumed the government had all this knowledge and could just, apply sort of select projects and activities from top down, and that, the various externalities that justify that intervention were well known, and you could deal with all these problems with sort of low dimensional policies like export subsidies or credit subsidies. I think the contemporary version of industrial policy that good jobs focused industrial policies are going to require are very different. It's going to require a much more collaborative approach that does not presume that the government or government agencies know exactly what needs to be done. Is going to require a process of learning, iteration, revision of targets, and it's also going to require an approach to policy that's sort of much more high dimensional, that goes beyond specific inducements. Next slide, please. All of that sounds, in some ways pie in the sky and possibly impossible, and raises the question of whether it can be done. Next slide, please. The fact of the matter is that, in fact, the kinds of principles to the application of policy in close collaboration with firms and the private sector is actually in operation in a number of different domains of the economy. Even in the United States, of course, which we don't think of as a country that's very fond of industrial policy, we know that there are extensive industrial policies, but industrial policies that have been targeted to date at very, very different ends. So the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, is an excellent example of this kind of collaborative, iterative process of progressive development of objectives through milestones and through ever more concrete goals and objectives and conditionality that has worked really well, except that, of course, it's not targeted at sort of defense-related technologies. It's not targeted at good jobs focused technologies. This kind of approach, so that's sort of at the very national level, you look at some workforce development projects that are run by non-governmental agencies such as Project Quest, which is a workforce development project in Texas. It works, once again, very much along the side of similar kinds of lines of working very closely with employers to determine what their needs are, invest in the requisite skills in the workforce. And that goes beyond the United States. Even countries that are famously known to have messed up with industrial policy have pockets of extremely effective implementation of these kinds of policies. Argentina, for example, has generated significant productivity gains in non-traditional agriculture using these kinds of collaborative arrangements between public sector agencies and private firms. Next slide, please. So the essential quid pro quo of this kind of a strategy is that essentially that this is not a process where you impose requirements on private firms. It's not just the stick. It's that there is a significant carrot as well, that the quid pro quo rests on the idea that firms have needs, whether it's training, it's infrastructure, contractual environment, other firms in the ecosystem on which they can rely on for inputs and for ideas transmission and so forth. So firms have a whole bunch of needs, and these needs of coordination and provision of public inputs of various kinds are provided by public entities, by governments. In turn, government agencies, the public sector needs for firms to actually internalize these good job externalities to increase the supply of good jobs through appropriate employment, investment, and innovation decisions. And the fact that the progress of technology in this area is so inherently uncertain means that we cannot treat this simply through Pigovian remedies of just subsidies to internalize this externality. And that's where I think this multidimensional interactive approach comes into its own in order to broaden the information elicitation that is required to do this dynamically and adequately over time. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I think we need to move from this welfare state model to this alternative productivist, much more production stage oriented good jobs model. And in my last slide, which is the next one, let me just end by citing what I think are some of the deeper benefits of the kind of approach that I've outlined here. First is that this is an approach that explicitly structuralist. That is to say, rather than taking the structure of the economy as given and redistributing through tax and transfer after the fact, it's one that is directly targeting the structure of the economy and trying to move the structure in a socially appropriate, more inclusive kind of a direction. Second, I say that it breaks through what I've called institutional fetishism. That is that, it's no longer about, markets and states. How much is it? Do we want markets or do we want the states? So these traditional conceptions and distinctions between market and state and regulation really no longer apply, because it's very much based on a complementarity of the thing, that this collaborative, iterative rulemaking under extreme multidimensional uncertainty sort of necessarily merges the roles of public entities. Third, I would say a very important point that we can no longer strictly separate the equality, inclusion, and the social agenda from the productive or economic growth agenda, because under sort of the problem of good jobs, those agendas essentially merge, because productive growth, overall growth, becomes possible only through the adequate dissemination of advanced technologies and methods throughout the rest of the economy. In other words, only if you can include the rest of the labor force in the most productive parts of the economy can you get growth, because otherwise you have the situation we have now, which is very high rates of innovation, but very much bottled up in few number of firms and few number of sectors, and so it doesn't show up in economy-wide total factor productivity. And so the path of higher growth and social inclusion essentially become one and the same. And finally, I think a big advantage is that this way of thinking about structures and how you can change it over time opens up a path of possibly radical institutional reform, but from very gradualist beginnings. So it avoids this dilemma of, are we going to change the system all at once, or do we just basically stick around to where we are? Because the kind of approach that I'm talking about essentially starts from existing beginnings, from things that already exist, but start to move them on a broader canvas in a much more definite direction. So let me just stop here, and I'm happy to have reactions, questions, comments, and thanks for listening.
So I await now questions from the auditorium. Please, I forgot to mention, please raise your hands, and if you want to speak, that is the best way to do it quickly. And I hope for voices. I don't see. Oh, here's a question from Eric Benedict. So I hope he's now going to speak. How come it doesn't work?
Wait a second.
Okay. In the meantime, I would myself like to raise a question.
Yeah, I could read the question out if you want.
Okay, go ahead.
So the question from Eric Kamp-Benedict is to Dani Rodrik regarding the quid pro quo of a good job strategy. That makes sense, but seems most applicable for national firms. It is less clear to me whether an MNC, multinational corporation, would face the same quid pro quo vis-à-vis a low-income country.
So, I mean, it's clearly that countries that are smaller, poorer, with less administrative capacity are going to have a somewhat more difficult time, but that's generally true. The point about my stressing the quid pro quo is especially to underline the fact that this is not a case where governments are essentially imposing conditions on firms without firms in turn benefiting from some, in return. So I think, if we go back to, the Scandinavian countries and Sweden under, traditional welfare state policies. Now, these countries were able to nurture world-class multinationals and productivity champions, because these firms understood that in return for those taxes, that they were getting significant public inputs and a productivity-enhancing environment from their governments. So I think that's the first level answer to that question, which is to say that there is a responsibility here both on the part of the government and of the firms, that the governments also have to be able to deliver. I think, but I think we need to go beyond that, and I think firms will increasingly have to understand that they have a stake in the system. So I think the whole discussion that firms are already engaged in with corporate social responsibility, the stakeholder model of the firm, the idea that it's no longer shareholder supremacy. It's because firms have come to understand that it's not in their interest to nurture economic, social, and political environments where, in fact, they're going to be the subject of a backlash. So I think what firms have been lacking, and that's, I think, largely what corporate social responsibility movement represents. They've been forced to respond to this through their own instruments, but that's highly imperfect because it's we don't want to leave the public purpose and the definition of public objectives to the firms themselves, and that's where I think there's a lot more job to be done on the part of governments and the public sector to provide a much better guide as to what this more this broader public purpose is. So will all firms be responsive to that? Not necessarily. So it's going to take a time. But I think that this is something that they've already made a turn towards, and that so it's not entirely impossible to make it a reality.
Okay. Any further question?
If you agree, Jan, maybe I'll read the questions out from the chat. That will probably be the easiest for you.
Okay.
Just very quickly for those puzzled. This is Andrew Watt, also from the IMK, just assisting Jan here, and I'll read out a couple of the questions. So please do write your questions into the event chat. So the next question is from Manuela Mahecha Alzate. I apologize if that's not quite properly pronounced. who's asking about the consequences of your policies, Dani, your proposals for the struggle between capital and labor. Does this imply higher wages, and what will be the impact then if it does imply higher wages for the conflict between capital and labor?
Yes, it will imply higher wages, but much more broadly speaking, better jobs. And I think higher wages is an important component of it. But I think a lot of it also has to do with much greater degree of autonomy and control of workers in the workplace, having much more of a say, having more fulfilling careers. So this is all part of the definition of good jobs. Now, I think the conflict that the questioner is asking about is this, if there is nothing that's happening in the background that's increasing productive capabilities, then simply increasing wages, of course, is going to run into a limit. That's why I'm emphasizing that this is not simply about imposing conditions on firms or requiring them to pay higher wages or generate more good jobs. It's also about creating an environment in which their own productive potential is also improved, in part by developing the workforce, the appropriate workforce, and the training along the same line. So just to give a very quick example, I mentioned this non-governmental project Quest in San Antonio, Texas, which is really just it's essentially just relatively small workforce training program. But what clearly distinguishes it, and it's now being copied by a number of other initiatives of that kind, is that it's not simply about investing in skills. It's actually working very closely with the employers and understanding what their needs are, developing a trust, and in response to that developing trust, actually being able to influence the human resource practices and the job qualifications that are posted and so forth on the part of the employers as well. On the one hand, you invest in the soft and hard skills that are very specific to the employer's needs. On the other hand, you also get the employers to understand the needs of the workforce and the availability of different types of workforce and how they can reshuffle and reorient their human resource practices in a way that actually takes advantage of the local labor market rather than being completely associated from it, or just working on the basis of some general best practices that are distant from the local context. So it is this joint relationship is one that's potentially can both increase productivity and therefore wages. And I think ultimately, it's the productivity angle of this is as important as the wage and good jobs angle.
Thank you, Dani. I think I should have to look at the clock. Time is running, and therefore I think we close the debate here, even though there are probably many more questions to be raised. But I think we understood the thrust of your argument. I should like to mention there is a paper from Dani and Charles Sable, which you find easily in the internet, which explains this type of industrial strategy in a more broader sense in more detail. So thank you very much, Dani. So you still have some time to listen to the first part of the next presenter's story. Then we come to Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph Stiglitz is going to talk, if I get it right, about the contents of this book, People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. I think it is an amazing book. It is not really an academic book, but it is written for a broader audience and readership. But it shows, especially from the angle of the United States, in which way a kind of progressive capitalism could evolve. But, well, the floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes. And a debate will then after Branko's presentation. So go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And I think Dani gave a wonderful presentation that is actually very complementary to what I'm going to be talking about. The formal title of my talk was, Is Progressive Capitalism or Social Democracy the Answer? And of course, when you act with a question mark, and the question is, what is progressive capitalism? And what is the question to which progressive capitalism is supposed to be the answer? I'm going to talk most of the time about a very narrow perspective on the second question. I'm going to be concerned about achieving, you might say, shared prosperity within our planetary boundaries. How do we achieve growth which is shared, taking into account climate change and the other limitations of our resources? So I take it that is the objective that we're trying to get at. Before answering the question, is progressive capitalism the way to do that? I think it might be useful, and this is the way I begin my book, is asking, what is the source of the wealth of nations? That, of course, was the title of the book that Adam Smith wrote, but he wrote that book before the era of innovation. He wrote it at the end of the 18th century, and the Enlightenment, of which he was an important part, actually set the stage for the enormous progress that has occurred since then. For centuries before that, standards of living had remained unchanged. Occasional fluctuations up or down, depending on Black Plague or other events, but basically unchanged around the world. And then suddenly, standards of living started to increase enormously rapidly. And the answer to that is not the answer you'll find in Adam Smith, obviously, is technology, science. We learned about nature and how to manipulate, control nature, and advances in social organization. Organizing a simple economy of farmers is relatively easy. Organizing an urban environment, organizing a complex modern society is much more difficult. And so there were social innovations, concepts like rule of law, democracy, separation of powers, checks and balances, all of the Enlightenment institutions, which together with science achieved enormous increases in standards of living for the vast majority of peoples around the world, initially in Europe and North America, and eventually through much of the rest of the world. There's a third ingredient I talk about, obviously motivated by some of what is going on in America and some other countries, that the success, both science and social organization, requires some mechanisms, institutions for ascertaining, disseminating truth. And the attack on our truth assessing, disseminating institutions, the media, educational institutions, research institutions, has been one of the most unfortunate aspects of recent political events. So that is, in brief, the source of the wealth of nations. The problem is that quite often there's a confusion about what makes for a wealthy individual and what makes for a wealthy nation. Individual can get wealthy by taking advantage of someone else, exploitation of other people. Now, the standard economic paradigm excluded that. It was not part of the possibilities. people were rewarded on the basis of their just asserts. So they received compensation appropriate to their social contribution, their marginal social contribution. But what I point out is the enormous theory and evidence that is accumulated that doesn't provide a good description of a modern 21st century economy, especially true in the United States, but to some extent true elsewhere. That much of the wealth of the people who are at the top is a result of a variety of kinds of exploitation, including exploitation of market power, exploitation of information asymmetries, exploitation of vulnerabilities, exploitation of the environment, all of those contributing to the wealth of some, but the impoverishment of others. So that defines broadly the agenda. The agenda is how do we improve innovation and direct innovation, and this very much fits in with what Dani was saying. We need to not only increase innovation, we need to steer innovation. I've done some work recently with my colleague Anton Kornek at the University of Virginia on the theory of the steering of innovation, building on a theory of induced innovation that goes back some 60 years. And some of my more recent work has identified strong market failures and public failures in the steering of innovation. Just because it so complements what Dani has talked about. If the monetary authority brings the cost of capital down to zero, obviously the only cost that is remaining is the cost of labor. So innovation is distorted towards saving labor. And we have indirectly had the effect of steering innovation in the wrong way. And then if you look at our tax system, it is a tax imposed on labor rather than capital, and again steering innovation the wrong way. And then we don't impose prices on the environment, so there's no incentive to innovate to protect the environment. Again, steering innovation in the wrong way. So the fundamental idea here is how do we increase increase wealth in a way that makes sure that the wealth that's created is shared more equitably, and it's all done within our planetary boundaries. And this is where progressive capitalism is the answer. Let me first point out there are many different kinds of capitalism. There's unfettered capitalism, neoliberalism. That is the source of our society's problems today. It believed that markets on their own were the solution, and it didn't recognize the multiplicity of market failures, and it believed in trickle-down economics and paid little attention to distribution. Then there's state capitalism, and that is being explored in China. That has its own problems, mostly political, but I believe also economic. I'm not going to talk much about that, but maybe in the question period we will. Within progressive capitalism, there are many different varieties. There's Nordic, abroad the social European social model. There's the East Asian kind of capitalism. Interesting, I spent a great deal of time studying East Asia miracle and what gave rise to their success. And many of the last remarks that Dani gave about the interaction between the private and the public sector based on trust, exchange of information, really was a characteristic of East Asian capitalism at that particular moment of time, at the height of their success. And it does give us some notion that it could be successful. So what do I mean by the broad idea of progressive capitalism? It's about a social contract between market, state, civil society, other actors. I want to emphasize that it's about the complementarity. It's not one versus the other. In that way, I'm very supportive of the perspective that Dani. There's a rich interaction involving risk sharing, rules, actions, investments, some of which I'll speak to in a moment. I want to emphasize too, though, that it's not just markets in the state. There's a rich ecology of institutional arrangements. If you look at the United States, the most successful institutions, I think, are institutions of higher learning. And almost all of them are neither market nor state institutions. They're nonprofit foundations. Yale, Columbia, Princeton, Stanford. They're neither market nor state. And again, the most successful, the only part of our financial system that did not engage in predatory actions, and which in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis continue to lend to small business, were our cooperatives, our credit unions. And so that highlights that we often focus too narrowly in just for-profit enterprises and government. That we should be thinking about a richer ecology of institutional arrangements and interactions. Now, as we think about the instruments that, in particular, government has, Dani laid out a whole set of instruments focusing on pre-production, production, and post-production. I've long emphasized said that we've emphasized too much the redistribution, which is the post-production. We should be emphasizing more what's sometimes called pre-distribution, and that is the pre-production and the production. And at the production level, what matters a great deal are the rules of the game. And the rules of the game include things like corporate governance, bankruptcy laws, but obviously also obvious things like competition policy and labor market policy. And labor market policy is not just about protecting workers, it's bargaining power. And we don't have too much of the standard economics focuses on competitive markets, and labor markets are never competitive, fully competitive. There's bargaining power, and you have to sort of balance that bargaining power. And so the rules of the game affect that bargaining power. And part of the rules of game are the rules of globalization. And those rules have actually been designed to undermine workers' bargaining power. And I mentioned that because that illustrates the rich interaction between the various parts of the rules. Rules that were supposed to be about trade turned out to affect labor and the distribution of income. And then, of course, there are investments in basic research, investments in infrastructure. And all those investments have distribution consequences. We've already talked about technology. The kinds of a technology that we can think about can either be labor replacing, which reduces the wages workers get, say particularly unskilled workers, or it can be intelligence assisting, increasing the productivity of middle and lower income workers, which would raise their wages. So how government makes those investments has a very big effect on distribution. Same thing. The fact that we've done such a poor job of providing public transportation to connect poor workers and middle-class workers with their jobs exerts a large toll on ordinary workers and creates inequality. So we can talk about the various functions within the social contract, the government modes the government can undertake, and we can talk about the various roles it plays, like redistribution, correcting the redistribution, risk absorption, addressing externalities, particularly important when it comes to the environment. So all of this gives, I hope, a broad perspective on why I believe that progressive capitalism is necessary. Unfettered capitalism has not worked. It has led to the kind of inequality that we have. Trickle-down economics has not worked, and growth has slowed down since the era of neoliberalism triumph, say around 1980. Why do I say capitalism? Some people say, well, why not just isn't progressive capitalism an oxymoron? And I say, no, that's not true. In a complex society, you need decentralization. You can't have central planning. We've tried that. It doesn't work. And economic theory explains why it can't work. The difficulty of solving that problem is just too great. So you need decentralization, but you also need rules, incentives, regulations that make sure that the power of that decentralized organizational structure is directed in ways that are not creating more rents, not exploiting other people, but creating wealth. And that has been the real problem. Too much effort has been directed at rent extraction rather than wealth creation. And that is why growth, since the era of neoliberalism, at least one of the reasons, has slowed down. And now, there are the final few minutes. Let me just talk about the broader agenda. I've talked. The narrow agenda was within, you might say, a classical economics framework where we're talking about creating wealth, shared prosperity within our planetary boundaries. But there's a broader agenda which can be thought of as creating the good society. Here, I think the role of progressive capitalism is even more important. There's a new strand in behavioral economics which emphasizes something that every parent knows, but is very different from standard economics. Standard economics says you're born with preferences. You're born preformed. But every parent knows he works very hard to shape his children. We want them to be honest. We want them to be cooperative. A whole set of values that we try to convey. The economic system shapes individuals. And there's ample evidence of this. You know, I have a lot of good students, very bright, and somehow some of them, when they go to work in the banking sector, wind up being selfish and exchange them. There's a lot of research in behavioral economics about how banking changes people, how studying economics, conventional economics changes people. The more they study conventional economics, the more selfish they become. Economics attracts people who are more selfish, but it also changes them. So my hope is that as we realize the economic system changes people, and the way the people behave affects how the economic system itself behaves, we can create individuals and an economic system that foster what we would think of as something consistent with our values. So more cooperation, more altruism, better behavior, less cheating, lying, less of the behavior of which Trump has become sort of the symbol of bad behavior in American society. And I think he's reminded us of the dangers of unfettered capitalism in shaping people in the wrong way. So that is, in some sense, my hope for progressive capitalism. It leads to a society with more trust. And in the end, I think those characteristics actually will result in a higher standard of living for most of our citizens. So again, it's complementarity. It's not as if being better people leads to less efficiency. I think a society with more trust is actually a more productive society. And we've seen in the response to the pandemic that societies in which there is a greater reliance on science and expertise, greater trust, greater equality, have performed better. Societies in which there's a closer approximation to what I call the progressive capitalism, the social contract of progressive capitalism, have done better in response to the pandemic. I think they're going to do better over the long run in the post-pandemic world. Thank you.
It was a wonderful presentation, and I think we let me summarize it in my own words, and you may add or reject what I say. It is a kind of welfare state that is, or what is progressive capitalism? It is a kind of welfare state but goes beyond this, and it includes a productivist element in the way Dani showed it, but you extended it. And it includes a new social contract with all the values and the institutions necessary to materialize. Is that a kind of summary of a very brief summary of what progressive capitalism is?
Yes, but I would add just two important other things. Rules and regulations that structure society. And investments, collective action in the investments that make for a stronger society. So it's not just about social protection. It's a social contract that involves all these elements that I've talked about.
Branko has now a much broader picture on capitalism and the future of capitalism because he brings in the global perspective. So, Branko, the floor is yours. What is global capitalism?
Thank you very much, Jan. I would try to speak for 20 minutes, as you said. I want to start simply by, you didn't show my book. I actually have it here, but I'll show it later. It's based on capitalism alone. Now, this is the structure of the book, which I'm not going to read because I'm sorry. Can you see the slide number 2, please? Can you show the slide number 2? I will speak today only about liberal meritocratic capitalism, which is the terms come from John Rawls, and meritocratic in this sense does not mean what we normally today call meritocratic. It simply means that there are no legal impediments to people acquiring any job so in other words, it is not a system of tasks. And liberal means two things, which of course I will discuss in a minute. That means that you have taxation of inheritance and you have free public education. These two things are crucial for breaking the ability of the rich elites to transfer the advantages in money and education to their offspring and to create an upper class. I will not speak about political capitalism of China. I just would like to mention to people who are interested, that was chapter 3, that this is actually in the context of the global historical role of communism. So that's, I think, a very interesting and in many ways it's a very Marxist and a very challenging chapter, but I will not discuss that chapter today. I will just talk about liberal and meritocratic capitalism. I go to slide number 4, which shows the income distribution in what I call classical capitalism. Actually, I would define capitalist systems not like sort of, approximately. I would define them on the basis of the interplay or interaction between the two different types of income, capital and labor. Now, typically in classical capitalism of Adam Smith or Karl Marx or David Ricardo, you have a group of capitalists and group of workers who are really two non-overlapping groups. If you look at this slide, you see all the capitalists have higher income than all the workers. So essentially, it's a system not only where the capitalists are richer than workers, but capitalists have no other source of income except capital income. Likewise, workers have only one source of income, and that's labor income. Now, if you go to the next slide, number 5, I'll skip number 5, sorry. Let's go to the liberal or meritocratic capitalism, which will be on slide number 6. Look at the red line. I just drew the red line very simply. You have on the horizontal axis, of course, people ranked by total income, and on the vertical axis, you have their income levels. So that red line shows you that when you go into the higher percentiles by income, you generally have also higher labor income. So that's the straight line, which is upward sloping. Now, look at the blue line. This is the capital income across the whole income distribution as well. For some 30% of the population, they have zero capital income because they often have wealth which is zero or negative. Then you actually start having some capital income, very modest capital income, but it's only at the top 5% or actually even at the top 1% that you have significant capital income which overtakes labor income. So notice that in this case, we don't have classical capitalism where the two income sources are received entirely by two different people. But we have a very high correlation between being rich and having high capital income. If you go to the next slide, which will be slide number 7, you see the sort of structure of what I call people's capitalism. What you have there, you have labor and capital income, and they, of course, are different because, richer people would have both of each. But everybody would have the same composition or the same structure of labor and capital income. In other words, if my total income is 1,000 and I have 700 from labor and 300 for capital, and your income is 100 and you have 70 from labor and 30 for capital, our structures will be the same. Mind you, this people's capitalism does not ensure income equality of total income. Actually, interpersonal income inequality can be still high, but it does ensure that there is no correlation between the specific types of incomes that you receive and your position in income distribution. So that's something quite important to keep in mind, that the composition of income, inequality in the composition of income is different from inequality in interpersonal income. So let me then go into really this more detailed study of liberal meritocratic capitalism, which I will have to sort of go relatively fast. These are the 6 systemic inequalities in liberal meritocratic capitalism, and I will go briefly over each of them, so I'm not going to read them on this slide. So if you could then go straight into slide 9, which is quite well known. So I took here from one of the authors, but I could have taken from many others. It's the first structural feature that we have in the last 30 years is the increasing capital share at the macro level. So this is, I think, very well documented, not only for the advanced economies, but it's documented also for the, emerging economies like China and others. So this is the first systemic feature. Now, if you go to the slide number 10, you would see why that systemic feature is a problem. That systemic feature is a problem because the blue line, which is on the top, shows you the Gini coefficient or the concentration of capital income, which is extremely high in all countries, all advanced countries. You see Germany, for example, with a Gini of about 0.9 for capital income, United States also with a Gini of 0.9 for capital income, and of course in all cases, capital income is much more heavily concentrated than labor income. I would like parenthetically just to make a point that very often people forget or don't pay attention much. In countries of Nordic capitalism, concentration of capital income is equally high, and in some cases even higher than elsewhere. You notice that, for example, for Norway, that you have also the Gini coefficient of 0.9 when it comes to capital income. Now, going back to what I showed you before in the very beginning, now you can see why the rising share of capital income in total is a problem for interpersonal inequality, because the unequal source is getting more and more important. And I think it's a fundamental issue that with automation, robotics, and so on, we will have to face. If the more unequal source becomes gradually more important, then we have to have some offsetting elements which would actually stop the spilling of that functional inequality, quasi-automatically leading to higher income inequality. This is, of course, shown also if you compare different countries, that, of course, in all cases, the Gini of capital income is higher than the Gini of labor income. I will skip that slide and move now to slide number 12, which is another structural feature that has, been sort of revealed in wealth data, is that essentially you have three classes of people in modern capitalism. You have people who are at the bottom, who actually have zero or negative total wealth. You have people between the 30th percentile and the 95th percentile who have essentially, that's the middle class, that have essentially all their assets in housing. And finally, at the top 5%, you have financial instruments that you can see here. 80% of gross assets of the rich are the financial instruments. So depending on the relative rates of return between these two, you would actually have rising wealth inequality or not. And very often financial instruments outperform housing. So let me then go to the next slide, which actually shows you the very high concentration of financial assets. In this case, this is for the United States, which stocks owned by the top 10% of wealth holders. So you notice there that actually that over 90% of stocks and mutual funds are owned by the top 10%. I am now on slide 14, which is a continuation of the sort of systemic features. And one of them is that you generally have, and that's actually a relatively unexplored topic, you have higher rates of return on the assets of the rich. In other words, on $1 of assets, the rich people generally tend to have higher returns than, let's suppose, the middle class. There are many explanations for that. It's actually obviously information level that they have, then entry costs, because obviously you're not going to have same type of advice if you have like $100 to invest, or if you have $100,000 to invest. Then let me move to the next, my third systemic feature, which is, I'm now on slide number 16, which is an interesting one, which is first time actually revealed in capitalism alone. It has never been mentioned, it has never been studied before. And this is the presence of both high capital and labor incomes received by the same people at the top. In other words, what this graph here shows you, the rising share of people who are in the top 10% by capital income, but who are also in the top 10% by labor income. So essentially, you have people at the very top of the income distribution in the US, and you will see that in a minute that it holds for many other countries, people who are essentially both rich capitalists and rich workers, as it were. So in other words, their salaries are very high. And that homoplutia, which comes from a Greek word which I created, actually asking my Greek friends if it made sense. Homo obviously means the same, and plutia means wealth. So the same people are wealthy in terms of labor and capital income. The next slide, which would be the slide 16, shows you that, you see different countries lined up, but the extent to which the same people are both capital and labor rich. You have countries like Italy and the Netherlands with 26% of people in the top decile being both capital and labor rich. And you have countries of classical capitalism at the bottom, Mexico and Brazil, where that proportion is small. And it's small because capitalists generally do not have labor income. So if you have sort of a classical capitalist type, which I've shown you in the very beginning, you are unlikely in that case to be actually working for wage. The number 4 structural feature is something that has been studied a lot, so I will very briefly go over that. It is the assortative mating. The graph shows you the greater likelihood of people who are in the top of their earning distribution to marry similar people who are also in the top of their earning distribution. This first slide, which is slide number 17, is for men. It actually goes back to 1970s US data, and then the next slide is the same idea for women. In other words, there are many reasons for assortative mating. Don't have the time to explain them. Obviously, part of that is because you have now many more women who are actually in high earning positions and also who also go to higher education. But nevertheless, this is an element which is quite important because not only does it add to inequality, combined with homoplutia, it actually perpetuates that inequality by the ability to convey that advantage to your offspring. And then finally, the thing which I take from Martin Gilens here is that we know that the rich, of course, have much greater influence on policies than the middle class and the poor. This is a complicated slide. I will not try to explain it, but the upward sloping line simply means that the responsiveness of the political system to the interest of the considerations of the rich is actually basically greater than to the considerations of interest of the poor. So let me then go to what I think actually are then I will go to slide number 24, which then sort of deals with policies. If you put all of these things together that I've said before, many of them seem to be actually inevitable results of globalization, technological change, and changes in the structure of the economy. So in other words, what has really happened is also that you had weakening trade unions because the structure of labor the structure of organization of labor has changed. You have greater difficulties of increasing taxation because of globalization. You have also greater skepticism by the population about the efficiency of social transfers. So that leads I think, actually to slide 25, where the objectives are twofold. My main focus of the change in the current type of capitalism that we have is to focus on pre-redistribution. In other words, to focus on endowments of two particular kinds. The first endowment is that endowment in financial capital, which is extremely heavily concentrated, as you have seen before, and that can be done through different forms. One is through increased worker shareholdings, which actually already exists in many forms, like with ESOPs in the United States, and also through greater incentives for small savers and investors. Ironically, what we now have are great incentives for large investors to avoid taxation and to actually invest and make returns, high returns, once they have large wealth. But for people who actually have very small amounts of wealth, these incentives are non-existent. So that would be the way to, in addition to inheritance taxation, to increase general shareholding in the population and to reduce the concentration of the financial assets. The second form of the attack on the equalization of endowments is through education. Mind you, you have really here two endowments that need to be equalized. One endowment is capital or financial assets primarily. The second one is skills, or what some people also call human capital. Here, the issue is not that we don't have an equal access to education, which is enshrined in Constitution and other documents. The problem is that that equal access to education is kind of a theoretical equal access to education, because the privately owned schools, the cost for attendance or tuition costs and other costs which go with it are so prohibitive that in reality, the current, particularly in the US, the current education system is essentially a monopoly held by the rich in order to make sure that only their children go through such schooling system, which then ensure very high wages of these children once they're out of the school system. And I think this is really a very sort of significant problem. We have, of course, studies. I'll show you on the next slide, and I think it will be my penultimate slide, which showed, of course, the college attendance rates by parental income percentile, which, of course, are very clear that actually the richer your parents, the more likely you are to attend a college. And, of course, that particular inequality is exacerbated, is magnified if you look at the very top colleges that practically serve only the top 5 to 10% of the U.S. population. So that's, one sort of very clear source of inequality. Now, you can ask me, how can we break that? Of course, there are, I think, different ways, but I think the most direct one is to make the public education much more attractive and of much higher quality. So, essentially, it would be only if you go through such public colleges that you will be able to achieve and to get to the positions with high wage rates, which currently are basically only reserved for the people who have gone through private and top private universities. So in that way, the two sources of inequality which we currently have, which is inequality in capital ownership with very high concentration, and inequality in human skills, which is the result of the reproduction through an inequitable education system, both of them would be tackled. And I think in that sense, I believe that the focus on endowments and on pre-redistribution is crucial if we really plan or, desire to reduce inequality in a sustainable manner. So I will stop here and thank you.
Very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, only a small chunk out of your book, but of course you have to select, and we will now go into the debate, waiting for questions out of the audience. Andy, it's your turn. There are 2 questions in the chat. Could you please?
Indeed, would you like me to? So the first question from Eric Benedict would be to Joe, referring to the current, the systemic racism in the US and dramatic wealth gaps between white and black households. So how is changing the rules of the game likely to address persistent structural inequalities of this nature?
Andy, perhaps we can take the second one as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so the second one from Oliver Richters, I allow myself to reformulate it a little bit, is essentially the sort of, do we need to fight inequality by changing the distribution of capital and ownership of wealth, or what is the scope for some ex post redistribution? Particularly the example mentioned here is universal basic income. Is this sort of ex post correction of inequality a viable way forward? Maybe I could abuse the floor and ask a bit about labor unions, as both speakers mentioned labor unions. maybe I could just add a question. What do you think is the role looking forward for labor unions? Do you think they can reinvent themselves by themselves, or would you think that unions are going to need sort of a change in the rules of the game by governments in order to be able to restructure themselves and become a force to reckon with again?
Okay, I think Oliver Richter's question goes to Branko, right? And yeah, then I would say, Joe Stiglitz, you start to answer your question, and then Branko.
Okay, so I think the rules of the game are really important. They have to be written, but they also have to be enforced. The big change that occurred in the United States in the 60s was passing a whole set of civil rights legislation, anti-discrimination, voting rights. Unfortunately, about 10, 15 years after the passage, there was a failure beginning with Nixon to enforce that, and that got even worse under Reagan. And so you did get some progress in the years immediately after the passage of these new rules, but it wasn't sustained. I think one of the reasons it wasn't sustained goes back to politics, and it goes back to the whole history of systemic racism in the United States, which, of course, 250 years of slavery, and it's a quarter of a millennium of slavery before the ending of slavery in 1865. And then there was a short period of Reconstruction in which people were, the former slaves were promised land and a mule. They started to get the vote. And then, unfortunately, that period, which is called our Reconstruction, was stopped because of the raw politics in the Republican Party. And that politics said Reconstruction was not as important as power. And it was at that point that you began the Jim Crow laws and the other forms of systemic racism that replaced the slavery itself. So finally, I think Americans have woken up. I think some of the social media, one of the contributions is they've seen the raw abuse, and they've seen some of that systemic racism. But finally, let me say that I believe very strongly with Branko that there needs to be an agenda which will provide the basis of closing the education gap and the capital gap, which is enormous. And it won't happen on its own very quickly. It has to be active policies. Now, let me in response to the second question, talk a little bit about that. Those policies have to be carefully constructed, because if under the current arrangements, there is a risk that, for instance, capital taxes might lead to less capital accumulation, and less capital accumulation could lead to a weakening of wages, at least in a standard model. So the proceeds of that, and I have some theoretical work where I show that even if in a standard model, all the proceeds of capital and inheritance taxation were given back to workers, they would become worse off because of the incidence effect. And what has to happen is that has to be those revenues have to be recycled into human capital and public capital accumulation to avoid the weakening of wages. And then that leads me to a response to the final question. I believe, when I talked about a new social contract, it recognizes the importance of collective action in many different forms, not only government, but also workers, co-ops, customers through class action suits. So the unions are the most important part of collective action among workers. And the problem in many countries is that the rules of the game have stifled the ability of the unions to be an effective counter to the increasing power of corporations. And so, yes, the answer is the rules of the game have to be changed. Both the rules that facilitate the organization of workers and the rules that affect the bargaining process of unions themselves.
Branko.
Yes, Jan, let me just summarize my point and also refer to something that Joe said. Let me make it very simple. What is my objective in what I presented today? If you actually have, look at very sort of in a simplified way, 3 different periods of capitalism in the last 70 or 80 years. The first one was the welfare state, where essentially, and take Nordics, which are really the good example, where you essentially left capital out. You said, okay, we were not going to touch it. You would even have high returns, but we expect you to invest. And we would then do redistribution at a stage where we basically tax people and redistributing. Then the second stage was after 1980s, where that actually became much weaker. In other words, of course, the capital part remained, but the redistribution through taxation became much weaker than it used to be. I think we are now in the need of a third period or a vision. And I think that vision is a long-term vision. As Joe said, it's not going to happen like overnight, but the long-term vision the third period, I think I'm now back. The third period should be the vision of people's capitalism, where the endowments would be sort of somewhat equalized. I'm not obviously saying that, of course, everybody would have the same amount of financial capital or housing or property in general, nor would everybody have the same level of education. But you would actually strive towards equalization of these endowments. So that was the objective, why I think we should go after the equalization of these 2 factors of production. Moreover, we should go after that precisely because the returns to capital or the capital share might continue rising in the future. And this is actually something which prompts people to now argue in favor of UBI, because they see the capital share rising, they see the potential or possibility of many people being left out of jobs, and they say, okay, let's solve that by having UBI. In my book, I'm somewhat skeptical about UBI for the reasons that are long to explain, although I have to admit that with COVID and the realization of what happened now, that had we had UBI, it would have been a much more effective way of dealing with it than having, stimulus packages every 3 months. So there are some advantages for UBI, but my main point is to focus on a longer-term vision whose objective would be greater equalization in skills and greater equalization in ownership of capital in general.
Okay, thank you. I remember that in both books, in Branko's book and in Joe's book, there are strong arguments against UBI. So, let's come to next questions. I hope there are some more. Andy, how about that?
So Thomas Goda was asking, particularly Branko, why not taxing high wealth instead of inheritances? What is the advantage of an inheritance tax over a wealth tax for the wealthy? And some pushback to Joe from Florence with reference to Argentina, where she argues that unions have a lot of bargaining power, and this may be one reason for Argentina's relative failure. So would you comment on that, that the unions in a sense can be too strong and restrict production?
Should I say very briefly on the first question? I have nothing against actually taxation of wealth. That can be also go together with inheritance. I'm simply a little bit worried about taxation, political impact of annual taxation of wealth. To me, it seems that inheritance taxation more sort of openly breaks that link of which I was speaking before, of ability to transfer, to convey all the advantages of wealth to the offspring. But I have nothing against wealth taxation. Maybe the two of them can work in unison. I just slightly prefer the inheritance because of its more clear nature of what it is supposed to achieve.
Second, Branko's view on
that. Maybe I can just add one little question to Branko, perhaps also to Joe. You didn't mention environmental taxes. Maybe they are not directly linked to redistribution, but they are important for other reasons. So that's mainly to Branko.
Yeah, that's true. I just would like to confirm that. Yeah, I actually don't discuss, and actually some people have criticized me for that. That's maybe a different topic, but I don't discuss it in the book.
Okay. So, Joe, it's yours. No?
So let me first speak just for a few minutes about the broad issue of taxation. Anything that can lead to a more progressive tax system, meaning lowering taxes on workers, especially at the bottom and middle, and increasing taxes on the top, will result in, I think, a greater equality, more shared prosperity. So what is particularly good in this area is taxes on rents, because rent seeking undermines economic growth. That was one of the things I emphasized. So taxes on pure profits, financial transaction tax, are all examples of taxes that generate revenue at the same time that they increase efficiency. And the same thing is about environmental tax. And then if you use that revenue rather to lower the taxes on lower income people, workers, or to increase their transfer payments to them of education, high quality education, or capital endowment. Tony Atkinson talked about having a capital endowment. All of those have to be viewed as sort of a package. And so, when it comes to the particular form of capital taxation, I view inheritance tax and wealth tax as complementary. Inheritance taxes are important to prevent the creation of an inherited plutocracy. They are directed at the intergenerational transmission of advantage of wealth. One of the reasons that is so important is that no matter what our capital taxes are, no matter what our wealth taxes are, there's still going to be high levels of inequality passed on through inheritances. So you need to have both. There are complex arguments about capital taxation versus wealth taxation. Again, I believe they need to be complementary. The reason for that is that there are forms of wealth, the returns to which are not subjected to capital taxation. Owning art, owning a horse farm, which may not generate income. So it has wealth, but it's not income. And so you need, if you want to get it comprehensive, you have to go about both capital taxation and wealth taxation. The problem in many countries, including the United States, is that capital is taxed at a lower rate than wages. the people at the very top pay a lower tax rate. Warren Buffett made that very clear. He said it's outrageous that he's paying a lower tax rate than his secretary. And he didn't even take into account the fact that he wasn't paying any taxes on his unrealized capital gains. His effective tax rate, if we looked at his total income in the Hank-Simons definition, which includes unrealized capital gains, realized capital gains, and other forms of capital income, his true tax rate was much lower than that of his secretary. On the issue of unions, what I said is we need a better balance. And in most countries, it is unambiguous that the power of unions have been eviscerated, weakened, and they are unable to adequately bargain for the interest of workers, and that's one of the reasons why wages have done so poorly. In particular sectors, in almost all countries, and in some countries, in many sectors, that balance may have gone to the other side. I don't want to make a judgment on any particular country. Having studied that process as clearly in other countries as I've seen it at work in the United States and to some extent in Europe. So yes, you need to try to achieve a balance of power. It's what John Kenneth Galbraith talked countervailing powers. In those countries where they have achieved a broader sense of solidarity, the conflicts that we see in can be reduced. The highest level of unionization is in many of the Nordic countries, and yet they have less labor strife. And that's partly because they've achieved a greater sense of social solidarity, and that's partly because they have a strong welfare state.
Okay. Just a very brief addition to what Joseph Stiglitz just said. When preparing this session, I learned that he is a Georgist. Probably our audience does not know what a Georgist is, but he is a follower of Henry George, who advocated taxes on natural resources, especially land, right? So now we have a box for you. You're a Georgist. But there may be more questions. Andy, you have more questions out of the audience?
I've been given two questions. Yes, one relates, I think it's for both colleagues, specifically to China and the evaluation of the Chinese model of state capitalism, and whether it deserves more credit, especially given its recent economic performance and recovery from COVID. And the other is a question from Guido Napoleon Papini. This is the second question about capital mobility and whether the necessary international coordination to enable capital taxation is possible in this given capital mobility. Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Joe, will you answer?
Okay. Anybody who looks at what has happened to standards of living in China, have to say that there's been a lot of success over the last 40 years. I first went to China in 1981. I first began discussing through the National Academy of Sciences with Chinese economists, academics about the strategy. And as they moved from communism to a state capitalism, a market economy of a particular kind, and they solved a lot of difficult problems in that transition. and the increases in standards of living, life expectancies, have been very impressive. The reduction in poverty has been amazing. They're at a different position now. The initial stage of catch-up is always going to be easier. So the challenge of maintaining that momentum going forward is going to be significant. At the same time, with the collapse of the Iron Curtain, there was the hope that trade would facilitate, and other kinds of interactions would facilitate a rapid convergence of all countries to liberal market economies or liberal democracies. And at this juncture, I think Francis Fukuyama, who wrote about this, talked about the end of history. That looks like Pollyannish fantasy. It's not happening very quickly. The pandemic has shown the power of a surveillance economy, a surveillance state, and the power of more authoritarian governments. But let me say they haven't done any better than New Zealand or South Korea, Taiwan, which have been able, within a democratic framework, to control the virus. So I think that those who believe in the importance of democracy and human rights have to conclude that you don't need authoritarianism in order to control the virus. You do need certain degrees of social solidarity, trust of citizens in each other and in the government, respect of citizens for each other. You have to have trust in science. So there are many, many aspects of what makes for a good control of pandemics, which those committed to democracies can look to and say those are the things that will lead to a better society, a better economy, and shared prosperity. I think there are many people who are worried that, in fact, the new technologies of surveillance, the power of the surveillance that has been exhibited in the pandemic, will, in fact, lead to more authoritarianism, more totalitarianism, and further undermining democracy. So that is a real concern. Let me just give a little bit of an answer towards the second question. I think that there is a big distinction between free mobility of short-term capital and opening of borders to long-term investment. The problem is that short-term capital can be very destabilizing. If you threaten to tax it, it can move. What long-term investment needs is a stable, productive environment. Countries can have high capital taxes and be very attractive for FDI, for foreign direct investment, if they have an educated labor force, a high level of social stability, political stability, good infrastructure. So I think one can have good redistributive taxation and attract, be open for foreign capital. But short-term finance is not closely associated with long-term economic growth. It's money that is more associated with instability. And this is particularly true for emerging markets. Now, finally, let me say that I think Europe made a mistake, which I hope they will eventually remedy, when they created a single market, allowing easy flow of all kinds of capital within the European Union without paying attention to the role of taxation. And so you have countries like Ireland and Luxembourg engaged in robbing their neighbors by either total tax avoidance or lowering a race to the bottom and low tax rates. That cannot be the basis of a long-term viable system. So there's a lot of discussion of trying to create at least a European minimum corporate tax rate, and it should be at a reasonable rate, 25%, not at the kind of rates that are levied by Luxembourg and Ireland.
Thank you. We have to come to the end. If there is no other question from the floor, Andy, then I would raise the last question to Branko, if I may. Andy, is there anything? Anyone?
Yes, it's 9 o'clock already, so
apparently not. Yeah, then I close with one short question to Branko. Branko, you use the term much explained in all detail in your book, People's Capitalism, as an alternative to the liberal democratic capitalism, which is on the demise, and on the other hand, political capitalism, which is a synonym for China and similar countries. And this kind of people's capitalism, is it complementary to progressive capitalism in the way Joe Stiglitz argued, or are there differences?
Definitions, and as I mentioned, people's capitalism definition, and as the definition of liberal and classical capitalism, is really based on the interplay between the relationship between the two key sources of income, labor versus capital. In other words, actually, I would see people's capitalism to be a situation where you would not have difference in the percentages of income received from property and labor across the income distribution. In other words, that percentage would be more or less the same. So you really would not have the association of high income status with a particular type of income, which is capital. Now, as I said before, that does not guarantee you low interpersonal inequality. Interpersonal inequality can still be high. So then you have the next step, if you wish to go towards that, which I call the egalitarian capitalism, where you would actually have two things. You would have the elimination of the class distinction, which comes from equal shares of capital and labor across the distribution, and you would have reduction of interpersonal inequality, which comes from essentially reduction of differences in income. So that would be to some extent, and not an end point, but an objective toward which you could actually move. But let me again emphasize that there are two parts to that objective. First, the elimination of the class sort of a structure, and the second, equalization of incomes. So it is not only equalization of incomes, but on top of that, you have also to eliminate the class structure, which comes from two different sources of income.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank both of you presenters. It was very, very interesting to have you here, and I think we all have learned a lot. The future of capitalism, the next crossing point will be next week, right? So we hope the best, and good night to everybody. Again, thanks
Thank
to
you very much.
the presenters.